Hello, this is David. Once again, thank you for your time and welcome. Today we're looking at the ego and false autonomy. Quite an interesting topic, if I may say so. Let's get started. It is reasonable to ask how the mind could ever have made the ego. In fact, it is the best question you could ask. There is, however, no point in giving an answer in terms of the past, because the past does not matter, and history would not exist if the same errors were not being repeated in the present. That's an interesting point, that history would not exist if the same errors were not being repeated in the present. So it's kind of like this. Do you ever sometimes feel like you're just going around in circles? Like it's just a repeating cycle, a repeating pattern. Yeah. So that's, I think, what they're talking about here. Okay. So it says it's the best question you could ask. Like, how could the mind ever have made the ego? For what purpose? Yet it's saying there's no point answering this important question in terms of the past. Okay. So let's read on. Abstract thought applies to knowledge because knowledge is completely impersonal, and examples are irrelevant to its understanding. Perception, however, is always specific and therefore quite concrete. Okay. Everyone makes an ego or a self for himself, which is subject to enormous variation because of its instability. We all know that. We're always changing. We keep saying people are changing. Now, the reason why, according to the course, is that the ego is inherently unstable. Okay? That's why it seems to change. Okay, it also says he also makes an ego for everyone else he perceives, which is equally variable. Again, here we're talking about projection. Yeah. And it's quite an interesting concept to put in mind, that when you look at somebody else, you're not really looking at that other person. You're projecting an ego on them. Now, let me stop here and just briefly speak about something that I let's say clearly saw last night as I was going to bed. Now, please give me a moment. We're just going to get off track a little bit, but I think this is important, okay? Now, I want you to consider how your eyes function, and I want you to consider what all physical matter is made of. Let's start with physical matter. According to science, according to quantum physics, according to science, all matter is made up of atomic particles, atoms and all that. And they are in turn made up of subatomic particles such as electrons, neutrons, protons, photons, all that. And now what these subatomic particles are, they are energy. They're not made of energy, they are energy. Okay? So it is incorrect to call them particles. We're just calling them that because it's, English. It's always got these limitations. But in real sense, an electron or a photon or a neutron is not a particle that sits in a point in space and time. It is what we might think of as a wave, which exists everywhere at the same time. And when we observe it, it becomes a localized particle. So it is both localized in space and time, and it is also eternal beyond space and time. That is the nature of energy. And you cannot see it with your naked eye. Now let's talk about the eye. What is the eye? How does it work, rather? We know that light, and light is energy, strikes the eye. Actually, light strikes everything. It strikes your face, your everything. But it is the eyes that sense the part of energy that you like to refer to as light. So it enters your eye. It's converted to an electric signal in your eyeball, retina, down the optical nerve as electric signals. Remember, it's not an image. When it hit your eye, it entered as energy, not an image. Energy. When it's going down your optical nerve, it's going down that nerve as electric current, you could say. Basically, electric impulses, you could say, you know. And also remember that the optical nerve and the eye is itself made of energy. Do you see what I'm getting to here? It's energy interacting. Anyways, so far, there is no image. I want you to consider life from the point of view of energy, because that is what life is. Anything else bigger than energy is a perception. In other words, because you don't have an electron microscope as your eyes, you cannot see the building blocks of what you're looking at. You can only see a gross estimation. Yeah. Anyways, so it goes up the optical nerve, gets into your brain. It is channeled, organized, whatever. It goes to a particular part of your brain dedicated to constructing an image of what you think you saw. So that signal goes to a point in your brain built to do this work. And then that place in your brain creates an image. There is no guarantee that the image created in your brain is a clear representation of what is actually out there that you think you saw. Remember, you're looking at energy, but your brain constructs an image. And we know from science and psychology and everything that the image constructed is very much dependent on the person's beliefs, previous experience, and so on. We also know from history that when the first Spanish ships were landing in the Americas, the native Indians at the time were looking into the ocean but did not see the ship, yet it was there, because they had never had any concept or experience of a thing called ship. So initially, according to history books, and you can check this out in Google or something, they didn't see it, yet it was there. Do you get what I'm saying? What I'm saying here is that this sentence that the Course has written, he also makes an ego for everyone else he perceives, which is equally variable, is telling you that when you're looking at your friend, Jane, Jack, or Ali, or some Japanese name. I'm trying to find international names here. Anyways, when you're looking at your friend, you're not seeing him or her as she is. You're seeing your construction of how they are. It could be a shared idea. It could be a construction that if you are to paint Ali or Jack for me, and I look at Jack, I would say that looks like Jack. But what I'm saying here, no matter how that magic happens, it is a construction that is happening in your brain according to the science that we know. Okay? So anyways, the Course says, he also makes an ego for everyone else he perceives, which is equally variable. Their interaction is a process that alters both, because they were not made by or with the unalterable. In other words, you were made, what's saying? The ego here is made by things that alter and vary, but you, your real nature, and your friend's real nature is constant. It's eternal. It doesn't vary. So anyways, the Course says it is important to realize that this alteration can and does occur as readily when the interaction takes place in the mind as when it involves physical interaction. There could be no better example that the ego is only an idea and not a fact. What they're saying here is that even if you're by yourself and thinking about your friend, this alteration occurs anyways. Have you noticed that? It's as if your mind doesn't care whether your friend is there or not. In fact, we know that the mind takes imaginary stuff in the same level. I mean, that's the power of visualization. They say that, when you visualize something, the mind doesn't really know that it's real or not. It takes it as real anyways. The mind is not stupid. It's not that it doesn't realize it's real or not. It's deliberately doing the same thing. Yeah. So here they're saying that, look, whether or not the person is in your vicinity or not, whether the interaction takes place in the mind or when it actually takes place with the other person, the effect is the same. And so it's saying there could be no better example that the ego is only an idea and not a fact. Your own state of mind is a good example of how the ego was made. When you threw knowledge away, it is as if you never had it. This is so apparent that one need only recognize it to see that it does happen. If this occurs in the present, why is it so surprising that it occurred in the past? Okay? So this is just talking about what we just talked about. Your state of mind keeps changing about you, about other people, whatever. You know, in other words, the ego that you've created for yourself and others keeps changing, okay? And they're saying that it's so apparent that you just need to recognize it and you'll notice that it happens, okay? So surprise is a reasonable response to the unfamiliar, though hardly to something that occurs with such persistence. So in other words, don't get so surprised that the ego was made millions of years ago or how it was made. That's irrelevant. What it's saying that, as you can observe today, your mind, which is a separated mind, one that believes in separation or whatever, is shifting things. It's changing your self-image all the time, and the self-images you projected on others. So if it happens today so frequently, why should it be surprising that it occurred in the past? But do not forget that the mind need not work that way, even though it does work that way now. Think of the love of animals for their offspring and the need they feel to protect them. That is because they regard them as part of themselves. No one dismisses something he considers part of himself. You react to your ego as much as God reacts to his creations, with love, protection, and charity. Your reactions to the self you made are not surprising. So it's not surprising that you'd protect your ego. In fact, they resemble in many ways how you will one day react to your real creations, which are as timeless as you are. So one day when you start seeing your real creations, you will also react to them with love, protection, and charity, and you'll forget your ego. But right now you're protecting and loving and charitying your ego. Okay? The question is not how you respond to the ego, but what you believe you are. Okay? So it's not how you respond to the ego. There's no appropriate, like, oh, it's better to respond to the ego like this or like that. They say what you believe you are that is the real question. Belief is an ego function, and as long as your origin is open to belief, as long as your origin is open to belief, as in you have not claimed your rightful inheritance, you are doubting it. Therefore, it is open to varying points of belief. One day you'll believe you're this, tomorrow you'll believe you're that, you know, or rather your origin. So as long as your belief is an ego function, it's not a spirit function, it's an ego function, and as long as your origin is open to belief, you are regarding it from an ego viewpoint. Okay? When teaching is no longer necessary, you will merely know your creator. Belief that there is another way of perceiving is the loftiest idea of which ego thinking is capable. That is because it contains a hint of recognition that the ego is not the self. So, the ego, the highest idea or thought form that an ego can come up with, is not the invention of the internet or, you know, discovering like nuclear physics or anything. That is nothing. The highest idea that ego can think of, is capable of coming up, is believing that there is another way of perceiving. In other words, a way of perceiving that is based on love. Yeah? And that is only because it is the only idea that the ego can have that contains a hint of the recognition that the ego is not the self. Okay? Undermining the ego's thought system must be perceived as painful. Undermining the ego's thought system will be perceived as painful. Remember what we said. you will love, protect, and charity your ego. Therefore, if anyone, including yourself, undermines the ego thought system, you will perceive it as painful, even though it's not. Okay? Babies scream in rage if you take away a knife or scissors, although they may well harm themselves if you do not. In this sense, you're still a baby. You have no sense of real self-preservation and are likely to decide that you need precisely what would hurt you most. Yet, whether or not you recognize it now, you have agreed to cooperate in the effort to become both harmless and helpful, attributes that go together. Your attitudes, even towards this, are necessarily conflicted because all attitudes are ego-based. This will not last. Be patient a while and remember that the outcome is as certain as God. Only those who have a real, lasting sense of abundance can be truly charitable. This is obvious when you consider what is involved. Okay? To the ego, to give anything implies that you will have to do without it. In other words, it's a scarcity mindset. It believes that if I give something, I'll have less of it myself. When you associate giving with sacrifice, because that's what I just said is actually the definition of sacrifice. You give away something and then you're left with less. That is sacrifice. Or you're left without. When you associate giving with sacrifice, you give only because you believe that you're somehow getting something better and can therefore do without the thing you give. Giving to get is an inescapable law of the ego. In other words, as long as you're ego-based, it is inescapable that you will give to get, which always evaluates itself in relation to other egos. Okay? So the reason why giving to get is an inescapable law of the ego is because the ego always evaluates itself. In other words, its self-worth is always in relation to other egos. It is therefore continually preoccupied with the belief in scarcity that gave rise to it. The ego arose from a belief in scarcity. What do you mean? I mean this. We said already the ego arose from a belief in separation. Separation is basically scarcity, isn't it? In other words, when you separate yourself from the larger whole and you think you're, let's say, not part of the larger whole, you've lost 99.999% of everything that you are, and you're holding on to the 0.00001 or whatever it is. So, its whole perception of other egos as real is only an attempt to convince itself that it is real. So you're literally holding other people hostage. You're forcing them to accept your ego because that is the only way you can convince yourself that your ego is real. Self-esteem is always vulnerable to stress, a term which refers to any perceived threat to the ego's existence. Makes sense, doesn't it? The ego literally lives by comparisons. Literally lives by comparisons. Equality is beyond its grasp. Okay? It's beyond. And charity becomes impossible. The ego never gives out of abundance because it was made as a substitute for it. Did you hear that? The ego was made as a substitute by the mind for abundance. Remember, separation is equal to scarcity. Therefore, it can never really give out of abundance. That is why the concept of getting arose in the ego's thought system. Appetites are getting mechanisms, representing the ego's need to confirm itself. This is as true of body appetites as it is of the so-called higher ego needs. Body appetites are not physical in origin. Isn't that amazing? All our body appetites like eating, sleeping, sex, sports, drink, all those. The Course is saying they are not physical in origin. This is crazy because our biology tells us that the body needs these things. So remember, sometimes, our science keeps evolving. In other words, what we thought was true 50 years ago, some of it we've thrown away and said that was complete madness. This is a new truth. In fact, It happens all the time. So this is jumping way farther ahead. It's saying, although biology and biology science tells us that the body needs these things like water, food, activity, sex, whatever, they are not physical in origin. It's saying that they are a getting mechanism that arose in the ego's thought system because it was made as a substitute for abundance. In other words, it lies in scarcity. So to fill the gap, it comes up with all these getting ideas. Getting is not a concept that was created by the creator, it was created by the ego. The ego regards the body as its home and tries to satisfy itself through the body. But the idea that this is possible is a decision of the mind, which has become completely confused about what is really possible. The ego believes it is completely on its own, which is merely another way of describing how it thinks it originated. In other words, the ego believes it originated on its own. It was created separately. Look at the way Genesis is written in the Bible. Just look at that. It is not exactly a story of creation of one, is it? It starts off as one. At the very beginning, in the beginning, there was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God, and there was nothing else, whatever. That's the end of it. One sentence in the Bible. After that, it's all about separation for the greater part of it. And look at the creation of Adam and Eve according to the Bible. Apparently, God created Adam. Now, the cause is saying God did not create Adam. Adam, or the idea... Okay, I don't mean Adam in that... What I mean is this. It gets confusing, okay? It really gets confusing. So let me just try and clarify myself. We have already said in this course that it's Genesis in the Bible talks about Adam being created and then falling into a deep sleep, and there's nowhere in the Bible that's mentioned that he ever woke up. And the cause suggested that it is this deep sleep that we are living in now, or rather, Adam is a metaphor. It's not like a real event in that sense. It is just let's say like a mythological story to explain creation, because all societies have mythological stories. Okay, so obviously the Jews or the Israelis had one, or the Hebrews, let's call it that way, the Hebrews, and their creation story is Adam and Eve in Genesis. That is their creation story of the Hebrews. But the course is trying to suggest that fine, there are things in the Bible that are pointing to what the course is talking about, and they give an example that in Genesis Adam goes to sleep and never wakes up, and this is the illusion that we've been talking about all along. Okay, now here it says the ego believes it is completely on its own, which is merely another way of describing how it thinks it originated. So I took you back to the creation story of the Hebrews in the Bible, because that's like the most famous one of all of them. And as you can see over there, the Bible says, one guy was created, then another girl was created. So it's this what we're talking about. The ego believes it was originated on its own. In other words, the ego believes it is completely on its own, which is merely another way of describing how it thinks it originated, that it originated separate on its own. This is such a fearful state that it can only turn to other egos and try to unite them in a feeble attempt at identification, or attack them in an equally feeble show of strength. It is not free, however, to open the premise to question. In other words, the ego is not free to question the idea that is completely on its own. The ego is not free to question the idea that it originated separately on its own. Why is it not free to question that? Because that idea is its foundation. It is because of that idea that the ego arose in the first place. You see? So the ego, this is an important sentence. As you can see, I've bolded it and underlined it for a reason. The ego is the mind's belief that it is completely on its own. The ego is the mind's belief that it is completely on its own. Do you see that? The ego is not a separate thing that is out there. It is simply a belief in the mind that it is completely on its own. In others, the ego is that part of the mind that believes it is separate. The ego ceaseless attempts to gain the spirit's acknowledgement and thus establish its own existence are useless. Spirit, in its knowledge, is unaware of the ego. It does not attack it. It merely cannot conceive of it at all. While the ego is equally unaware of spirit, it does perceive itself as being rejected by something greater than itself. Okay, so in a nutshell, these two don't see each other. Spirit is unaware of the ego because it doesn't engage in a false idea. In fact, it cannot conceive it because it knows. So, and the ego is equally unaware of spirit, but it feels that something greater than itself has rejected it. This is why self-esteem in ego terms must be delusional. The creations of the creator do not create myths, although creative effort can be turned to mythology. Okay? In other words, it's all an illusion. It's a delusion. It can do so, however, only under one condition, that it makes that it can do so, however, only under one condition. What it makes is then no longer creative. So it's saying, that the ego can make up illusions. That's for sure. Okay. But those illusions can never be made real. And since they cannot be made real, you can no longer call that creative or creation, because creation is permanent. What you can call it is image making. Okay, so moving on. Myths are entirely perceptual and so ambiguous in form and characteristically good and evil in nature that the most benevolent of them is not without fearful connotations. Yeah. Now, let's look at our mythology. Myths and magic are closely associated since myths are usually related to ego origins and magic to the powers the ego ascribes to itself. That's why myths and magic are closely associated. Mythological systems generally include some account of the creation. We just talked about that a few minutes ago when we were talking about Genesis. Yeah, and in fact, every tribe or race or peoples that I know on earth, I'm sure there are many that I don't know of, all seem to have a creation story. I am from Kenya. In Kenya, I come from a tribe called the Kikuyus. The Kikuyus have their own mythological story. This is how it goes. My tribe believes that a long time ago, a man and a woman called Gikoyo and Mombi lived on a mountain called Mount Kenya. You can Google Mount Kenya and you'll see how it looks like. It actually exists. It's a real mountain. So this couple, Gikuyu and Mumbi, were placed there by a god that the Kikuyus call Ngai. Okay? So Ngai put Gikuyu and Mumbi on the mountain, and from there Gikuyu and Mumbi had, I can't remember, 7 or 12 children, and from there the people were created, the other people. So it's a bit similar to the Hebrew one, although the Hebrews and the Kikuyus were not like talking to make up the same story, but they have a similar story. You see what I mean? Anyway, so mythological systems generally include some account of the creation and associate this with its particular form of magic. The so-called battle for survival is only the ego's struggle to preserve itself and its interpretation of its own beginning. This beginning is usually associated with physical birth because it is hard to maintain that the ego existed before that point in time. Yeah, think about that sentence. The beginning of the ego is usually associated with physical birth. Do you see how amazingly powerful the mind can specify an illusion to maintain a belief? First, it creates a body and physical form, or rather images of such. Because, as we've seen, from the building blocks of everything that exists in physicality, quantum physics, this whole idea of being born and dying does not really exist at that level. According to physics, energy can neither be created nor can it be destroyed. It can only change form. If you've ever done high school physics, not even college level, high school physics, you'll know this basic law of physics, that everything is energy, and energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It can only change form. So the whole idea of birth and death is something we perceive at this gross level with the approximate tools of perception, eyes, ears. Those are they're not accurate, they're just approximate. But at the real level of the building blocks of life, birth and death are not as we see them. Anyways, the more religiously ego-oriented may believe that the soul existed before and will continue to exist after a temporary lapse into ego life. So it's just saying that we talked about the beginning, starting at the physical birth, because it's hard to maintain that the ego existed before that point in time. And we said, remember, the ego conceives itself as created separately. Therefore, birth is a perfect way to demonstrate this belief. But it's saying here that the more religious, in quotes, have an idea that a soul existed before and after the lapse into ego life. And then it says, some even believe that the soul will be punished for this lapse, for, going through humanity. However, salvation does not apply to spirit, which is not in danger and does not need to be salvaged. Do you see how the Course keeps separating? It keeps saying, forget about this whole soul, spirit, whatever. Those don't need any salvation or any help. Focus on the only one thing that does need help: your mind. Your body doesn't need help. Your spirit doesn't need help. Your mind is what needs it. Or rather, salvation, according to the Course. Salvation is nothing more than a right-mindedness, which is not the one-mindedness of the Holy Spirit, but which must be achieved before one-mindedness is restored. So they're saying that salvation is simply right-mindedness, but that is not the end. The higher self, which is also called the Holy Spirit, the higher self has one-mindedness. But to get to one-mindedness, you must have right-mindedness, and then one-mindedness will be restored. Okay? Right-mindedness leads to the next step automatically, because right perception is uniformly without attack. And therefore, wrong-mindedness is obliterated. The ego cannot survive without judgment. That's cool. The ego cannot survive without judgment. And we just said here, right perception is uniformly without attack, which means it has no judgment. And that is why it automatically leads to one-mindedness. So the ego cannot survive without judgment and is laid aside accordingly. The mind then has only one direction in which it can move. Its direction is always automatic, because it cannot be dictated by the thought system to which it adheres. Because it cannot but be dictated by the thought system to which it adheres. What this means is that the direction of the mind is always automatic, because it always follows the thought system that it believes in. So if it believes in the ego or separation, then its direction will automatically go towards separation. If it has attained right-mindedness, or at least no attack, then automatically it will go towards oneness. It cannot be emphasized too often that correcting perception is merely a temporary expedient. It is necessary only because misperception is a block to knowledge, while accurate perception is a stepping stone towards it. The whole value of right perception lies in the inevitable realization that all perception is unnecessary. This removes the block entirely. You may ask how this is possible as long as you appear to be living in this world. That is a reasonable question, my friend. You must be careful, however, that you really understand it. Who is the you that you are living? Who is the you who are living in this world? That's a good question. Who is the you that is living in this world? Spirit is immortal, and immortality is a constant state. Therefore, we can conclude that it's not spirit that is living in this world. It is as true now as it ever was or ever will be, because it implies no change at all. It is not a continuum, nor is it understood by being compared to an opposite. So you cannot understand spirit or immortality by comparing it to mortality. Also, you cannot understand immortality by thinking of it as a continuum into time, like infinity back from the beginning of time to the end of time, if there is such a thing. So this idea of a continuum does not explain immortality. You can't understand it that way. So forget about thinking of immortality or eternity, for that matter, in terms of a continuum of time. Neither can you understand it by thinking of its opposite. Okay? Such as like being mortal or being time-based. Eternity is not the opposite of time. It is not. Okay? Knowledge never involves comparisons. That is its main difference from everything else the mind can grasp. Okay? Who is the you who are living in this world? That's a very interesting question. So, that's it for this topic. Thank you. Like I told you, this is going to be an interesting topic. It's it's deep, isn't it? It's really cool. So, thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next topic.